All right, we will get going. We may have others joining as we go along. Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday, and welcome to the first, as far as I know, ever Implementation Science Beachside Chat. My name is Allison Hamilton, and I will be your host for today. I am an anthropologist and implementation scientist based at UCLA and at the VA Greater Los Angeles. And I lead the UCLA Rapid, Rigorous, Relevant 3R Implementation Science Hub, which is hosted under CHIPS at UCLA in the Department of Family Medicine. And I want to thank NIMH for funding this and 4 other hubs that are designed to support projects that are part of the Ending the HIV epidemic. So we're all coordinated through ISKI at Northwestern and the wonderful team there and folks across the country working on these hubs and doing what we can to use implementation science to end the HIV epidemic. So thank you all so much for joining. We are very excited to launch this series. I'm going to do just a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our very special guest for the day. So we are in Zoom, as you know. We are recording, and the link to the recording will be available on the CHIPS website. We're not going to be slide heavy today. We're just going to have a few slides in the beginning and then at the end, but there is contact information at the end should you need any information. This is meant to be a very interactive session, very informal. So it's not a presentation, it's a chat between Erin and myself and all of you. So we'd ask that you put questions and comments in the chat box. We know there's a Q&A box, but we're just going to use chat for today. Obviously, if you put something in Q&A, we can work with it, but we're going to try to stick to chat. And I would just humbly ask now, and I will ask again later, to please be sure to fill out the very, very brief, I promise it's brief, evaluation that will be coming your way after the session, because it really helps us to know how to improve these sessions, what you want to see more or less of. And I promise it will just take maybe a minute or 2 of your time. So that would be really helpful for us if you don't mind completing the evaluation. So on that note, Elena, did I remember everything?
Sounds good, Allison.
Okay, thank you. And many thanks to Elena for making this happen and facilitating this whole program. So I can't thank you enough, Elena. And on that note, I think we can move to our next slide, which is to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Erin Finley. Erin and I have had the great joy and fun of collaborating for many years now. We're both anthropologists and have known each other a long time. And then had the great fortune to be able to really start working together about 5.5 years ago when we started working on the Empower query together. So Erin is one of our 5 amazing consultants for the 3R Hub, and you'll be hearing from the other consultants in the months to come. So I'm just so excited that Erin is kicking us off with this Beachside Chat series. And Erin, you can see her affiliations here on this slide. She's based at both UT Health San Antonio and at the VA Greater Los Angeles in our center there. Erin, hello and welcome to the Beachside Chat. Yay! Hello! We're so happy to have you. Do you want to do just a little intro beyond anything that I've shared about you?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I do a lot of implementation science, and I think relevant for kind of some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. I work with a lot of different teams across a lot of different settings, dealing with trying to implement a lot of different kinds of interventions. And I think that working across spaces has definitely informed my thinking, but that's it.
Great. Well, I can't wait to chat with you. We're going to just get started today with a couple of polls, just so we know a little bit more about the folks who've joined us today. So I think Elena will take us to the first poll, which is just about what setting you primarily work in, just to give us a flavor for, where you all are based. Great. So we have mostly folks in academia, 82% in academia, 7% government, 7% nonprofit, and 4% other. That's super helpful. Thank you so much. And then we have one more poll question for you, which is about kind of how you identify your role in implementation science. So whether you consider yourself an implementation scientist, a practitioner, are you more interested in learning about implementation science and or the practice of implementation? And with this one, you can select everything that applies to you. All right, I think we're okay. We're capping out at 90%. Thanks everyone for your participation. So we have 21% who consider themselves implementation scientists, 20% implementation practitioners, 88% interested in learning more about implementation science, and 70% interested in learning about the practice of implementation. So that's, again, really helpful. Thank you so much for your participation. And now we can move on to our topic for the day. Next slide, please, Elena. So our topic today is designing for success in implementation practice and research, insights from behavior design. And I, for one, am super intrigued by this topic and excited to talk with Erin about it. She's been learning a lot about it really in the last few months, I want to say, is when you've kind of gotten really into this type of thinking. So I'm so excited to learn from you, and I know everyone who's with us today is as well. So what we're going to do is come out of the slides. I know it's radical to not be based on slides for a session, but what we really want to do is just talk with Erin. Again, I'll monitor the chat and go back and forth between some questions that I would love to ask Erin, but also keep an eye on questions that you have. So feel free to put them in, and I'll jump back and forth between chatting and checking the chat as often as I possibly can. Okay, so let's just start by talking about behavior design. What is it? Why do you care about it? What's going on with behavior design?
Okay, so let's kind of break this down into little bits, because I can really go on about this for some length, and we want to keep this useful, sort of useful chunks. So useful chunks. So behavior design is really about, it's a set of methods, and it's intended to be used in developing and designing for behavior change, either at the individual level and or at the team or organizational level. So it's really about how do we think about behavior change and how do we set up for behavior change. And that set of methods is really based in what's called the Fogg behavior model. And this is based on work by BJ Fogg, who directs the behavior design lab at Stanford. And he has a very interesting perspective because it's really based in kind of behavior science, but it's also based in several decades of consulting with industry. So it's got a much more industry perspective to it than a lot of the work we do in implementation science. And that was something that I found really useful, because kind of really stepping out of the work we do and looking at it from some different perspectives was very helpful. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about the behavior model it's based in. And then at some point, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the core underlying maxims as well, but I don't know that we want to do all that at once. But the fog behavior, okay. The fog behavior model itself is really simple. It basically says that behavior is going to occur when motivation, ability, and prompt all occur at the same moment. So to sort of play that out a little bit, we think about motivation on a continuum that can be high. People can be really highly motivated to do something, or it can be low. Ability can be similar. Something can be really hard to do, or it can be really easy to do. And we think about prompts as being something has to happen to prompt a behavior most of the time. It doesn't, sometimes we think of something spontaneously and we run with it, but particularly when we're talking about inserting a new behavior into workflows, which is usually the sort of scenario we're describing in implementation, we need to think about what's going to be the trigger for this event, what's going to be the prompt for this. So for an example, if we were trying to think about, we're trying to get a primary care provider to do a depression screen. So if that primary care provider has high motivation to do the depression screen, it's really easy for them to do. If they then get the prompt, which say in this case is a clinical reminder, they're pretty likely to go ahead and do that depression screen. If they get that same clinical reminder when their motivation is low, or they're not able to do it, they've got 5 different screens they have to click across to get there, that prompt's not likely to be very successful. So you've got what is essentially one implementation strategy, say the clinical reminder, but it's going to land very differently depending on what else is going on with that individual at the time. So that's kind of the basic model, and that's very simple, but the more time I started to spend with it, the more I found it really useful, as particularly in thinking about as a way in for maybe people who are really interested in implementation science, but haven't necessarily been able to grasp the whole. There's theories and there's models and there's frameworks and there's all these different moving parts. So starting to think about what are some simpler core ideas we can start with that can be kind of a scaffold toward getting towards more complexity in implementation science and practice.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds, okay, well, let me, before I get into some questions about behavior design and its implications for implementation science and the way we design the work. And I already see some cool questions coming in the chat, so I'll go over there in a minute. But I think in our conversations about this previously, there were some kind of either missing pieces or not strong enough pieces in how we're thinking about implementation that kind of motivated you to learn more about this. So can you just talk a little bit about what you were seeing missing or what you wanted to do more of that made you excited about behavior design in the first place?
Mm-hmm. For sure. So for one thing, and this is kind of what I was trying to get at in the introduction, I spent a lot of time trying to build individual and institutional capacity for implementation science. And in a lot of ways, I think the most interesting and important part of what I do is as a boundary spanner across different spaces for this work. And so one thing I saw was a lot of people who were really interested in implementation science getting turned off by, this model has this many pieces and and we do a lot of that. So some of it was just kind of looking for where can we find some more bite-sized chunks to get people started? Because I don't look at something like this model and say, oh, this is the end all and be all for everything. But I do think that it's very compatible with a lot of other models and frameworks. So thinking about, okay, could we use this as a starting point and then expand out from there as needed based on what we learned? So that was part of it. And then part of it was, I feel like, and maybe this gets a little bit more to the maxims, I feel like I really appreciated the emphasis on breaking down interventions that we're trying to implement into kind of basic behavioral components. Because I think we often talk about interventions as the large sort of nebulous things, but we're much more successful when we can really take it down to small chunks and think about what has to happen for each of these chunks to be successful. So I thought that was a really important insight. And again, there's certainly implementation science work that has done that, but I don't necessarily feel like we always do that to the extent that we should. The other piece, there is an emotional intelligence to this, and I don't know quite how else to put it, that I think really gets to the fact that we talk a lot about attitudes. We talk a lot about barriers. We talk about things like that. But there's a really big difference between an attitude and a motivation. And in so many of the cases for implementation that I've worked in, there was a really powerful emotional component to it that doesn't necessarily get, I don't feel as though we often feel comfortable or quite know how to articulate that in our work in relationship to the models and other perspectives we're using. So finding something that built in a little bit more flexibility and room for that really spoke to me. So part of what
That's
I found.
great. Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about how, you know, in implementation, it's just far from a neutral process. You know, like the way we often describe it and conceptualize it has that sort of scientific neutrality. But then when you actually are trying to do something and change what people are doing, whether it's have them do something new or have them do more of something or less of something, that emotions are involved in that, motivations, emotions, very strong feelings sometimes, which can definitely impact whether they want to change or not, whether they're open to it, whether they'll take it on. And I think those are malleable too, you know. So it's interesting that it really gives us room to think about that more. So I remain intrigued. I'm gonna just take a look at some of our chat questions. So the first question is, what about the role of environmental construct in your explanation of the simplistic behavior model?
Okay, I would like to say at this point that I'm a card-carrying anthropologist, so I firmly believe in context. For me, that's not a question. I mean, that is a question. I don't mean it that way. For me, I assume that context is impacting motivation and ability and the prompt at every level. I don't see those as separate to some. So, okay. I'll take just one moment and say that my theoretical background back when I was really spending all my life living in anthropology was within critical phenomenology, which is really this piece around understanding what is the individual experience and how is that shaped by the larger social structural contexts. So I started out studying the experience of trauma and PTSD as shaped within these larger medical models and political conflict and all of these things. So for me, I always come back to thinking about, yes, of course, context is part of the individual experience. But if we don't understand the individual experience within that context, we're not going to get very far in working with that context. So for me, it is baked in.
That's sort of like, I mean, the way I think about it is sort of the interplay, and even the way we set up studying it is sort of the interplay between those environmental, or sometimes they're called external context variables, so to speak. But it's, I think from our anthropological perspective, if I can join us together for a moment in that type of training and disciplinary background, is that we're often, if not always, looking at sort of the situatedness of the actors in those settings, in those contexts, and how that context kind of, I think of it as sort of, you know, playing back and forth with those motivations and emotions. You know, a lot of the emotions that folks have are going to come from their history and placed within a given organization. So it's not only about how they feel about what's being introduced or taken away in the case of de-implementation, but also, you know, how does their environment kind of play into their attitudes toward change, et cetera. So it's all kind of connected up, so to speak, from the way, and it sounds like behavior design can account for that, or it can be part of accounting for that, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Because I mean, a lot of what's going to be motivating is what's motivating within that specific context for that individual, given their place within the context. Right. So I don't think you can fully understand any of those pieces without context. That's a critical piece of it. But I also think it's baked into those concepts.
I just want to ask one little follow-up question, then I'll go back to a couple of questions in the chat. So I wanted to go back to the point that you made about how this particular approach really comes from industry. And
Yeah.
and we look at other implementation strategies that very much come from industry as well, like quality improvement. And so I'm wondering, in what you've learned about behavior design and its kind of roots in industry, does industry do a lot about sort of context and environment and all that? Is that a relevant question to ask?
It's a fantastic question. I don't think I know the answer. I will say, so I did an intensive training in behavior design over the course of a month with a group, and the rest of the group were industry folks. And it was incredibly interesting because I'm such a naive little academic in many ways. And it's a whole world that I hadn't explored. And the problems that they were facing, I mean, they were absolutely as sophisticated and savvy and understanding the connection between individuals and organizations and larger policy contexts and all of that as anything else. But I don't know the answer to that question. It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it might be something I'm wondering. Now I want to go back and see, because even when I think about the quality improvement roots in industry, it really has a lot to do with the behaviors. Changing behaviors, organizing people's behaviors. And, we try to, especially in evidence-based quality improvement, we try to really infuse that multi-level stakeholder perspective, which does take more of the context into consideration, I think, and the institutional priorities. But I don't know, just something that we might want to be thinking about and playing with.
Well, I think so. And certainly, another place that I've found is a whole area of the literature that I don't know very well. And I don't know that we've fully embraced implementation either, would be kind of organizational studies out of the whole business schools. I mean, one of my colleagues has her PhD in that, and I'm not characterizing the field correctly, so my apologies. And I mean, they just have this tremendously sophisticated understanding of organizations and individuals operating within those, and how people work together to do sense making and all of that. I mean, that's where a lot of kind of the social science development of complexity science came out of that field. So I think we all have lots to offer. The more we can talk to each other, the better.
Right, and lots to learn. I mean, the whole organizational psych realm. I mean, there's so much. All right, I'm hogging you to myself. So okay, that was Manaj's question. Thank you for asking a question that inspired so much interesting discussion. Sarah's question is, so how do you get people to do the right thing each and every time? Smiley face. I like the smiley face.
Okay, so can I take that as a cue to run over the maxims real quick, and then we can hash out the maxims?
Yeah.
Too? Okay, so there's two formal maxims, and then there's an informal maxim that I think is so important that I like to think of it as a maxim. But the maxims are: help people do what they already want to do. Now that one we can have a chat about, because this is implementation, right? Half the time, nobody ever wants to do this stuff. Sometimes they do, that's nice. But certainly that's something important, I think, to think with, and I'd like to play with that a little bit. The second one is help people feel successful. And I think that's another incredibly important piece that really sets us up for some opportunities. And the third one is simplicity creates behavior. So all of these are pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but I think have a lot of utility in just thinking through, particularly on the front end of implementation planning and design, how we can really do our best to set people up for success. I think in answer, going back to Sarah's question, I think one of the things I really like, and you'll see when we get to the end, there's a visual on thinking about where you're likely to have success in shaping behaviors or encouraging particular behaviors, and where you're less likely to have success. But the general idea is, if somebody is very high in motivation but low in ability, you're not going to have a lot of success in getting them to the behavior. So you need to work on supporting their ability. Now, whether that means changing the organizational structure of how their clinic is organized so they can get the appointment times they need, or whether you need to give them training so that they have better ability to actually perform the behavior. That can mean a whole lot of things, but that would tell you something about where you need to prioritize your implementation strategies as you're going forward. If they have really a high ability, it's not a very hard thing, or they already know how to do it, but the motivation is low, well, that's going to set you up for a whole different set of implementation strategies you need to pursue in support of motivation and encouraging that. And again, if you wanted to take the simplicity of this and really explode it, you could then go to the behavior change wheel and the behavior change taxonomy, and that entire field that is around kind of mapping different pieces, different change techniques to different behavioral needs and whatnot. But I think the general piece about this giving us an opportunity to think about where do the real, is motivation the problem? Is ability the problem? If so, what's the problem? And how do we start to name that can be really useful in starting to prioritize where do we need to move first. I think a lot of the models, and I love this about the models, is they are neutral. And you can map out the entire landscape of inner setting, outer setting, individual, patient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you have no idea where to start because you have this beautiful landscape that doesn't help you necessarily to prioritize. What I like about this is it gives you a way of starting to identify, okay, here's the really key things we need to start with. And if then we need to reiterate from there around additional strategies we need to add in, or novel emerging problems we need to deal with, you can also do that. So there's different ways of approaching it. But
I have so many questions, but I'm going to ask a few more from our audience before I get into my questions. I'll try to remember them. There's a question from Jay, and Jay is one of our amazing co-investigators on the hub. So thank you, Jay, for your question, which is, given that motivation and ability are both fluid, is the framing of prompt static, or is prompt also fluid?
Oh, what a great question.
Great question, Jay.
I think that's fantastic. I don't know the answer. I think it's such a great question. I mean, I think, so, okay, thinking about this purely from an implementation science perspective, I think most of the time our prompts would be static. However, I love the question because to me, it's thinking about how do we then set this up for success. If you are setting this up for success and you're realizing that the prompts might need to be fluid, that seems like an opportunity to design a fluid prompt. But I think it's a great question. What do you think, Allison? Does that, yeah.
So I'm thinking about most of the prompts that come to mind when I think of how do we kind of motivate behaviors. They do tend to be more, like the ones that are coming to mind are more static. So I'm trying to think in your conceptualization, Jay, what a fluid prompt would look like. And what comes to mind for me, although it might be off base from what you're thinking about, is that prompts, I think, would possibly be very prone to evolution. And so that might be some of the fluidity of the prompt, is that it's not, you're not going to always use the same prompt in all cases, under all circumstances, in all contexts. And a prompt that you use at the beginning of an implementation process might need to be quite different in another phase of the implementation process. So I could see them being more fluid in that regard, but I still feel like there might be even a piece of your question that is beyond that conceptualization. So if you are thinking of more, then put it in the chat and I'll try to get to it.
And maybe
I'm gonna go. Yeah, go ahead.
Could I add one more last thought to that? So the other piece of this that I really like is there's an explicit focus on creating habits, and habits is another thing. Right. It's there in implementation science, but we don't. There's some great work on it, but we don't always necessarily think about the connection between sustainment, which we talk about a lot, and habit, or this piece about routine use. From what I understand of the literature on science on habit, you do want the prompt to be as consistent and static as possible, because again, you're trying to dial in a very specific kind of circuit that's going to go the same way each time, because you want to remove the effort of having to think about it. And it seems as though a fluid prompt would potentially require additional effort, whereas a static prompt, that if it was the right prompt at the right time, might not. But again, that's all hypothetical, because we haven't even talked about that. But Jay, we might need to have another session to talk about your question once we understand it. Sorry.
Thankfully, Jay is part of the hub, so we can have lots of conversations about that. I'm going to go to a follow-up question from Manoj and then a question from Eric. So Manoj asked, is your explanation about the inbuilt context not advocating victim blaming?
Oh, that's so interesting. No, I don't think so at all. Oh, what an interesting question. No, actually, I almost want, I mean, for me, I think it's really the reverse. So thinking about, okay, let's think about it a little bit more broadly and think about the maxims a little bit. So the first maxim is help people do what they already want to do. And I swear this is relevant. One of the things that I think we have a problem with, and I think it's absolutely a natural problem. So it's not really a critique, it's just a, how do we think about this going forward? Which is, we have a lot of interventions we've built that we've accumulated the science for, we've got the evidence for, we've got the effectiveness, but there is not demand for them. We have gone out and gotten some acceptability outcomes maybe, but acceptability is not the same thing as demand. I think a lot of the problem that we have when we have an intervention that we're really trying to get providers to do, and providers really are resistant to it, I think we have failed often to really understand why providers or staff or whoever the people who are resistant to, or patients are resistant to it. There's a reason. There's probably usually many reasons. And if we don't understand those reasons, then we cannot build something that's going to be aligned to support those folks in moving towards something better. So I absolutely see it not as victim blaming, but as understanding where people are within this larger context and helping to support them so that they have power too. It's such an interesting question, but for me, it really comes from a place of, I think the reason we're seeing a rush towards things like user-centered design, human-centered design, multi-level stakeholder engagement, is we've realized if you don't give a voice to everybody involved, you're less likely to be successful. And so one of the things I really like about this is it gives the opportunity to identify all the behaviors involved, all of the individuals involved, and do a better job of making sure their needs are met and getting to where they need to be even be able to do this stuff. And it takes that as a really front and center kind of goal. So.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think hopefully there is no sense of victimization in the implementation process, but rather just a lot of opportunities for understanding and sense making. And part of what I'm hearing, about this particular approach is that there are some fundamental things that we need to make sense of, and we probably need to make sense of them pretty early, and then continue to look at them all along. And that's something that we may get to in a little bit in terms of, if we think sort of practically, and you and I are both very practical people, if we think very practically about how we might use this in the design of an implementation project, what might that look like? So we may have time to go there in just a little bit. There are a couple more cool questions in the chat that I'm going to pose to you first, and then we'll see how much time we have left. But actually, Eric's question kind of gets at some of the design issues. So Eric asked, do you apply the same behavioral model the same way for patients as you would to providers' systems?
Yes. So that's one thing I like about this, and it's the simplicity of it, because it does then apply. Now, are all of the different folks touched by this intervention, which if it's a patient-facing intervention, certainly includes patients, going to have the same motivation, same ability, and same prompts? No, they're probably not. They're going to have different
But if we don't understand each of those perspectives, components, challenges, et cetera, again, then we're not going to build something that's designed to be aligning everybody moving in the same direction. So yes, the same model, but exactly the same learning from applying that model at for each of those groups, of course, are going to be quite different. Did that make sense?
It does to me. Hopefully it does to Erin too. And Manoj, I see you have a couple more questions. I'm going to come back to them if we have time. I'm just going to make sure that we try to cover the many different things that are coming up in the chat. So I'll come back to you. I'm not ignoring your follow-up questions. Pete asks, how do you parse out the distinctions between attitude and motivation? I'm reading it slowly for myself too, so that I'm grasping it. It seems to me that depending upon the motivational type of prompt, one's attitude may be somewhat irrelevant.
Oh, that's so interesting. Gosh, I want to hear more. So I'd love to hear the example. So I think, attitude. I think exercise is a great thing and it's super good for me. That's very different from motivation, like, gosh, I really wish I could get to the gym today because I know I would feel better, right? These are different things. So when you dive deeper into the Fogg behavior model, there are some continua for understanding different kinds of motivation. And they're really basic things like pleasure and pain and hope and fear and acceptance and rejection. I think this is to some degree a Venn diagram, right? You are going to have overlap between attitude and motivation probably most of the time. I do think there are probably circumstances in which you're right, attitude is irrelevant. I mean, if the motivation to move in a direction that's away from your attitude is strong enough, you're likely to do it. And I guess that's one of the things I really like about this model is I feel like it's much more based in human behavior. Whereas I feel like a lot of our implementation science theories and models right now are very rational. They really treat humans as kind of rational actors, where if we have attitudes, we will plan for things, we will do behaviors. And that it hasn't proven to be wildly effective because humans are just funny little critters and they sort of run off and do unexpected things often. But I think your question about where does attitude fit with that is a really important one. And I think in some cases, attitude is probably going to be more important, and in other places, it's probably going to be less. So,
right. I mean, if you think about institutional motivations such as mandates, then your attitude, you may have a bad attitude about it, but if your boss says or your institution says you have to do this, then your attitude, may matter a little less in what happens. It doesn't necessarily mean your attitude changes, but that kind of dynamic between motivation and attitude is a really interesting thing to explore. And might it help us, like if there's alignment between attitudes and motivational prompts, what would we see with implementation? I think it's an open question. I don't think we really know, I think there are any number of possible ways of approaching that and ways of answering it and hypothesizing about it and so forth. So it's a really interesting question, Pete. Thank you so much. Sure. And Kenda might be going there. Hi, Kenda. Kenda, as a fellow anthropologist, and some of those others who've asked questions maybe too, I just don't know you. But Kenda says, I think institutional motivation is an interesting concept to bring up. If by industry, we're talking about a profit-driven sector, then trying to change behavior could take on a different kind of flavor than, say, changing behavior to improve public health. I mean, thinking about industry as having an institutional motivation for behavior change. She said, no idea if this makes sense, but thanks for making me think.
No, I think that's great. I mean, it is so interesting and so different. So the kind of the mythology around behavior design is that the founders of Instagram came up with the initial model for their business in this class at Stanford.
So it definitely comes with a very sort of Silicon Valley industry tech kind of baggage to it. And I think there are a lot of really interesting questions to be had around, the difference between trying to get individuals to do something, trying to support individuals in doing something they want to do, and then thinking about the organizations and this okay, so maybe this is a quick time to touch back on that first maxim, which is help people do what they already want to do. The reason I like thinking with this is because in implementation science, we just often don't have that luxury, right? If the evidence says we need to do depression screening in primary care, well, primary care providers, I know they care about their patients, but it's probably not the highest thing on their motivation list when they sit down with every single patient to do that screening, for example. But to the extent that we can build in more of how do we build interventions that are more in demand, I think that's really useful and important. So
Yeah.
thanks for making us think, Kendra.
Yes, there's so much good stuff going on in the chat, and I don't think we're going to have enough time. So I'm going to try to do 2 more. And I'm truly just doing these in the order that they're showing up. So sorry for those who have put in later comments, which I can't see yet. But there's a question from Claire, who's at one of our fellow implementation science hubs and at UCSD. And then there's a question from Tom about measurement, Tom from UCLA. So I think they're both some cool ways for us to move a little bit toward wrapping. So I'll do Claire's question, and then maybe we can at least touch on some ideas for Tom's question as well. And another reason why I'm bringing up Claire's is because I think it points a little bit to our next month's session with Anna Bauman, which will address, at least to some extent, her and other colleagues' recent efforts to really place a lot more emphasis on improving health equity in implementation science. So please sign up for next month's session as well. So Claire's question is, how and when do you know when behavior change is not the approach and policy organizational change is the approach to take? Particularly thinking about health equity, how do we remove focus from individuals and focus on macro level changes when or as appropriate?
Love that. I love that. Again, the way I think of it, okay, so maybe let's walk this through a little bit. So if I'm doing a study and I'm thinking about this framework, and what I'm hearing from the people involved is, there's no way I can do this. The policy is misaligned. It's pointing to do that. It requires, okay, so here's an example from a few years ago in Texas. I was working with a lot of community-based providers around delivering evidence-based psychotherapies for PTSD. Okay, the state at that time did not have a compensation code for cognitive processing therapy in their system. So that was something that really had to go to the state level to change the policy before we could even move the ability measure for those providers. And that's a much simpler example than a health equity example, which may be more systemic. But I think that's what I mean when I say that for me, if we go looking at motivation, if we go looking at ability, and we really understand what people are telling us about what's shaping those things for them, that can tell us what level the actions then need to go to. They may need to go to the state level or the national level. They may need to go to a community level or a more local, regional level. So, and I think starting with what we're hearing from the people involved then can tell us very powerfully what implementation strategies and at what levels those need to be applied. I think what we do a lot of now is we start with the implementation strategies and then we apply them. But I like the idea of let's stop and figure out what's going on, and then we're much more able to be thoughtful and wise in our targeting from there. And yes, that absolutely may involve policy and larger level changes.
Yeah, exactly. And then Tom, appreciate the question, what I consider to be a more practical question, and we love being practical. And we'll probably only have time for this one last question, but we will have a record of all of your questions in chat and try to address them in the follow-up communication with you, which we need to talk about, but we'll try to do that. So Tom's question is, what are some measurement strategies that would be recommended for implementation under the FOG behavior model?
It's a great question. I don't think anybody's done anything with that specifically.
Yeah.
I'm using this model in a very small scale implementation study right now, and we're starting just with qualitative work, sort of informed by this model. So we've built our interview guide around this, and it's really been helpful. I haven't thought about the quantitative piece. I'm sure you could get to that. And I would be really interested to hear how people who are much better at measurement than I am would do that, because I think it could be done. I think we can measure motivation and ability or perceptions therein, just like we can measure attitudes. But off the top of my head, I don't have anything useful to add there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an open question, and it might be helpful. I do want to mention that I learned from Elena that there are a couple of questions in the Q&A as well. So just in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to shift over to those, but we will, what Erin and I can do, if it's okay with Erin, is just work through the remaining questions and provide some brief written thoughts. Probably not too extensive, but just, I feel badly because there are such great questions, and this is exactly what I was hoping would happen in these chats, is that they would get people thinking and commenting and asking tough questions that we could probably talk about for many hours. So we will, take a look at all the things that have come up and try to provide some brief responses, and also any resources that we can think of that might be helpful. But I did want to just have a moment to go back to the slides, because Erin provided a visual of the model that we've been talking about, so it might help to kind of tie some of the things that have been coming up together. And then we'll wrap for today's session, even though I would really like to continue talking for many hours. But Erin, now that this is up, first of all, it has a couple of references there in case people want more information. But anything that you want to kind of tie together here now that we have the visual with us?
No, I guess the only thing I would add would just to say, I like this as a visual because I think it helps to think about, if you think about a given problem set and the folks you're working with and trying to support them and moving towards some implementation related change, you can think about, okay, is motivation more the problem here? Is ability more the problem here? What do we need to do to help move them to a place where any implementation strategies, any prompts we're building into their workflow are going to be more successful in achieving that behavior change they want to see and implementing whatever interventions they want to see. So I think this can be a nice way. I also, and getting back to some of the questions, thinking about how do we avoid blaming people? For me, we really have to embrace this from such a stance of assuming that people are doing the best they can. And that seems so simple, but I think it's so important, because, if people are telling me, I really don't feel motivated to do this because I don't think it's going to work. For a researcher, that's such an incredible gift, and that psychological safety to allow them to say that, and to allow them to say, I can't do this because of X, Y, and Z policy. It completely makes this totally irrelevant for me. So I think the prompt there for me is to really think about, how do we build that safety and openness into the interactions we have with the people we're working with, so that they can be very real about where their genuine challenges are. I also wonder if that's another way in which attitudes can be a little bit counterproductive, because we're asking about, what are your attitudes, and that sort of implies there's right attitudes and wrong attitudes, and that's not it at all.
No.
It's always a lot more complicated than that, and people are genuinely doing the best they can. So how do we support them in looking where they're trying to go? Anyway, all of this goes much further. There's a lot more to it, and there's some even great methods offered in, for example, the book there. So I would encourage folks to look at it a little further. And it's also, these are things I am playing with, thinking about a lot, working with, building into the work that I'm doing. So if you do have any interest or any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, because I'm delighted to talk about them.
Thank you so much. And that's really what these Beachside chats are meant to achieve, is to just get some thoughts out there with experts such as yourself, kind of what's on your mind, what are you working on, what's intriguing to you, and we'll continue in this vein for the next 4 months with our other consultants who you'll see momentarily on the slide. But I just want to thank you so much, Erin, for taking the time to talk with us about this. I'm guessing that folks' minds are buzzing and really wanting to think through many of the, if not all of the super interesting things that have come up from you and also from our amazing audience. So thank you all for your contributions and for your active participation, and to Erin for being just an incredible partner in this Beachside chat. If we could just go to the next slide, Elena. So just for upcoming Beachside chats, we hope you'll keep coming back. We'll be hearing in February, as I mentioned, from Anna Bauman. We'll be hearing from Jeff Curran in March, Matt Chinman in April, and Russ Lasko in May. I highly recommend all of these sessions. I can't wait to do them. So we really hope to see you come back and also share information about the Beachside chats with your colleagues. This was everything I hoped and more, Erin, so thank you again. And we'll just close on our last slide, I believe it is, which is, please don't forget to fill out the evaluation. And if you do have any questions that you want to direct to me or to Erin, or any questions about the hub, you can email that and it will come to us, and then we can follow up from there. And we'll definitely follow up with all of you with responses to the questions that we weren't able to get to. And we'll also send out a link to the recording of this session and put it in Twitter and on the CHIPS website and various other places where folks might be able to access it. So thank you all so much for coming. Erin, any parting thoughts from you? No? Okay. Thanks. I wish you were here at the beach with me. I'm not quite at the beach, but I'm closer than you are.
That's true.
So, I think it's the Maldives behind me, though. So, you know, I'm definitely not close to the Maldives. But we hope you enjoyed this session, and we look forward to seeing you at future sessions. Thank you so much, everyone. Take good care. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.